I still remember that camping trip like it was burned into my memory. I've been out in the woods plenty of times, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. Wild animals creeping too close to camp, storms rolling in out of nowhere, even people wandering off trails looking lost. But nothing really prepared me for what I stumbled across that evening, deep in the quiet part of the forest, when the air was heavy and still, and everything around me felt unsettling in a way I couldn't shake. It was late summer, about 5 years ago. I had driven out with a couple of friends to a quiet campground that wasn't well known, the kind of place where you rarely run into anyone else. The drive-in was long and bumpy, and once you passed the last paved road, there was just a dirt track winding through trees that seemed to go on forever. We set up our tents close to the creek that cut through the woods. It was a beautiful place. Tall trees packed tightly together, patches of moss covering the ground, and the sound of running water that filled the silence at night. That day had been calm. We cooked over the fire, walked along the creek, and even found a few old game trails to explore. But later in the afternoon, I went off on my own. I like having those moments alone in the woods, where I can just take everything in without distraction. The sun was dipping low, the light spilling through the trees in that golden way that makes everything look unreal. I remember how quiet it was. Even the birds had gone still, like the forest was holding its breath. As I walked, I noticed a tree that didn't look right. It wasn't the tree itself. It was what was hanging from one of the lower branches. At first, I thought it was just rope someone had left behind, maybe from campers before us, but the closer I got, the more the shape came into focus. It was a noose, tied neatly, loop hanging down, swaying just slightly in the still air. My stomach tightened. I froze, staring at it, trying to process what I was looking at. Then I noticed movement. Just a few steps away, standing near the base of the tree, was a kid. He couldn't have been older than 16. His clothes were plain, worn down like he had been wearing the same thing for days. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he held the rope, trying to get it looped up over the branch properly. The whole sight hit me like a punch. For a second, I felt like I shouldn't even be there, like I had walked in on something I wasn't supposed to see. He hadn't noticed me yet, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could tell he was serious. This wasn't a joke or some dramatic gesture. He was really about to do it. I finally moved, my boots crunching on the ground. The noise made him look up, and everything stopped. His hands froze, his eyes wide, caught between fear and shame. For a long moment, neither of us moved. He looked like he wanted to disappear right into the ground, like being seen was worse than whatever he had been about to do. I didn't say anything. I couldn't even if I wanted to. My throat was dry, and words wouldn't have worked in that moment. I just stepped closer, slow enough not to scare him, and kept my eyes on him so he knew I wasn't going to turn away. He let the rope drop. His hands shook harder now, but he didn't run. He just stood there, looking small and broken, like the weight of the world had been crushing him for too long. We walked back together in silence. He didn't resist, didn't argue, just moved beside me like he had no energy left to fight. Back at camp, my wife was by the fire, and when she saw him, I could tell by her face she knew something wasn't right. She didn't ask questions, didn't push. She just gave him space and warmth, offering food, a blanket, anything that might make him feel less alone. It was later that I learned his story, not from him right away, but slowly over time. He had come out to his family not long before, and instead of support, he had been cast out. His parents had told him he wasn't welcome in their home anymore. His siblings turned their backs. He had no one, nowhere to go, and the woods had become his escape. That tree, that rope, had been his answer to the emptiness. We kept him with us. He stayed in our spare room for weeks, barely talking at first, just eating, sleeping, trying to find some sense of safety again. Slowly, bit by bit, he opened up. My wife treated him like family, and I tried to give him the space he needed, letting him come to us instead of pressing him. Eventually, he reached out to a relative, a family member who, unlike his parents, was willing to take him in. When he moved in with them, he was still fragile, but there was a spark of hope that hadn't been there when I first saw him under that tree. Years have passed since then, and we still keep in touch. He's grown stronger, built a life for himself, surrounded by people who care about him. Sometimes when we meet, I still see that scared, pale kid in the woods, standing under a tree with a noose in his hand. But then I look at the man he's become, and I know he survived because in that one moment, when the forest was silent and the sun was sinking, I happened to walk the right path at the right time. That camping trip changed the way I look at being out there in the wilderness. The woods can be peaceful, yes, but they can also hide things you never expect, things darker and heavier than any animal encounter or storm. When I think back on it now, it still unsettles me, the idea that if I had taken a different turn, if I had decided to head back earlier, I might not have been there at all. That boy could have gone through with it, and no one would have found him until it was too late. It's a thought that haunts me even now, but it also reminds me that sometimes being present, just being there, can change everything. That trip was supposed to be another quiet escape into nature, but instead, it became the moment I realized how fragile people can be and how much it matters when you choose to step forward instead of turning away. And that's something I'll never forget. I've camped alone more times than I can count, but there's one trip that will always sit heavy with me. It wasn't because of some wild animal encounter or a freak storm, and it wasn't because I got lost or injured. It was because of the kind of fear that creeps up on you slowly, the kind that doesn't really hit until you've made it back home and you realize just how close things came to being worse than you imagined. It was late spring, and I wanted a break from everything: work, noise, and constant notifications on my phone. I picked a spot I had read about online, a small, tucked-away campground about 2 hours from town. It wasn't one of the popular ones with marked sites and families parked in RVs. This one was more primitive, just a handful of cleared spots scattered along a dirt road that twisted deeper into the woods. I liked that. I wanted peace and quiet, maybe even the chance to not see another soul for a few days. When I arrived, there was no one else around. The last stretch of the drive was bumpy, full of potholes, and lined with thick trees pressing in close. When I stepped out of the car, the air was cooler, fresher, the kind of clean that makes you realize how stale city air is. The only sounds were birds and the faint rustle of leaves high above. I set up my small tent near a slope that looked down on a trickling creek. I gathered wood, started a fire, and settled in with the satisfaction that comes from being far away from everyone. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, watched the fire burn down, and listened to the steady rhythm of crickets. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt calm, almost weightless, the way I always do after a day outside. I slept deep and dreamless until the pale light of dawn. The second day, I hiked further down along the creek. The trail was faint, barely used, but it led me through thick patches of pine and into a hollow where the water pooled wider. I stayed out there for hours, just walking, sitting, watching the water flow. I didn't bring my phone except to take a few photos, and I barely looked at it otherwise. That's the freedom I always crave out there. The sense that the world could spin on without me, and I wouldn't even notice. But that evening, something shifted. Started subtle. While I was cooking by the fire, I got that prickling feeling, the kind that makes the hairs rise on the back of your neck. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild from being alone in the woods. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt it, that strange awareness of being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the trees were still, nothing moving but the shadows stretching as the sun dipped lower. When night fell, the unease didn't go away. I banked the fire and climbed into my tent, but sleep was restless. I woke several times to sounds, snaps of twigs, crunches in the underbrush, things I usually brushed off as raccoons or deer. Still, this time it felt different. The noises weren't random. They seemed to circle, moving slowly from one side of my camp to the other. I lay stiff in my bag, heart thumping, telling myself over and over it was just animals. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. The third morning, I walked the area around my camp. At first, I didn't notice anything, but then, near the edge of the slope, I saw impressions in the dirt. Not paw prints, boots. The tread was faint but clear enough to know someone had been walking there. They weren't mine. The spacing suggested whoever it was had been standing still for a while, just above the creek. not far from my tent. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself maybe it was old, from some hiker weeks before, but it didn't sit right. The soil there was soft, not the kind that holds prints for long. Whoever it was, they had been there recently. That day, I stayed closer to camp, uneasy about leaving my things. I kept glancing at the tree line, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The woods were calm, almost too calm, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When night fell again, my unease turned into something sharper. The noises started earlier, just after the fire burned low. Steps, deliberate and heavy enough that I knew it wasn't an animal. I sat in my tent, knife clutched in my hand, hardly breathing as the sounds drew closer, then paused, then shifted to the other side. I didn't move, didn't unzip the flap, just listened. Hours seemed to crawl by before the noises faded into the distance. By the time dawn broke, I had already made up my mind to leave. My nerves were shot, and the peaceful trip I had wanted was gone. As I packed, I noticed more boot prints, clearer this time, circling my campsite. Someone had been walking around while I was asleep. The drive out was tense. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might move. Every bump in the road made me check my mirrors. When I finally reached pavement, it felt like breaking through some invisible barrier. I didn't stop until I was back in my driveway at home. Later, when I had settled back into my routine, I kept replaying it in my head. The boot prints, the circling sounds at night, the certainty that someone was out there watching me. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had come into that forest, seen me camping alone, and decided to linger close by. For what reason, I'll never know. Maybe curiosity, maybe something worse. That's the thing that unsettles me the most, the not knowing. Out there, miles from anyone, no cell service, no one to hear if something happened, I was vulnerable in a way I hadn't fully understood until then. I always thought the woods were my safe place, a place where the only dangers were the natural kind. But now, whenever I camp, I can't shake the thought that the most dangerous thing out there isn't the wild at all. It's other people. That trip changed the way I camp. I still go, but I'm more cautious now. I pay closer attention to the ground around me. I listen harder to the night, and I trust that feeling in my gut when something doesn't sit right. Because I know now that the quietest, most peaceful place can turn threatening the moment you realize you're not as alone as you thought. And that knowledge lingers long after the fire has burned out. When I think back to that camping trip, I still feel the hair rise on my arms. It wasn't just because of what I thought I heard, but because of the way my mind tried to make sense of it. At the time, I was younger, maybe around 10 or 11, and my family had taken me and my brother out to camp in the woods. It wasn't a big campground with crowds of people, more like a quiet, half-forgotten site tucked between thick trees. We had pitched 2 tents, one for my parents and one for me and my brother. The night air was heavy, almost suffocating. Our little tent was hot inside, even though the forest outside was damp and cool. I tossed and turned on top of my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable. My brother was already asleep, his breathing steady, but I couldn't drift off. The nylon walls trapped the warmth, and every sound outside seemed louder than it should have been. That's when I first heard it. A faint, soft sound, like a whimper or a muffled cry. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe some injured thing in the brush. The sound carried strangely, thin but clear. It wasn't sharp or sudden, more like the tail end of someone crying under their breath. I froze, my ears strained, pressing themselves into the silence. The sound came again, faint, almost delicate. My body tensed up in a way I couldn't control. I tried telling myself it was a fox or maybe a coyote pup, but something about it didn't sit right. It was too human. The forest around us was black. Our tent's mesh vent only gave a faint glimpse of the dark outlines of trees. I could feel my heart beating harder than it should. Then the sound shifted. What made it worse wasn't the noise itself, but the way it seemed to move. One moment it felt distant, almost behind the tree line, but the next it was right outside, close enough to make the fabric of the tent feel paper thin. I held my breath. I couldn't hear any footsteps, no crunching of twigs or rustle of leaves, just that soft, pitiful sound. Then, without warning, it rose into something sharp. Not a whimper anymore, but a full, piercing scream that cut through the stillness like a blade. It echoed, too high and sudden, and then it was gone. Silence rushed back in, and I could hear the night insects again. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, listening, waiting for it to return. My brother didn't stir once. He just kept breathing in his sleep. My body was rigid, my palms sweaty against the thin fabric of my sleeping bag. My mind tried to come up with reasons, explanations. The scream hadn't been animal-like. It had been too raw, too deliberate. I don't know how long I lay there before my body finally gave in and let me sleep, but I remember waking in the morning with a strange ache in my chest, like I'd spent the whole night bracing against something. The sunlight washed everything out, making it look harmless. My parents were cooking breakfast over the small stove. My brother was poking around near the fire pit. For a while, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. The forest was quiet and ordinary in the daylight. But when I stepped outside the tent and walked a few feet toward the tree line, I noticed something odd. The ground near the brush had been disturbed, not trampled like by an animal, not scattered like deer prints. It was as if someone had stood there for a long while, toes pressed into the damp earth. I couldn't make out a full footprint, just impressions in the soil. Long, narrow shapes with a faint drag at the edge, as if someone had been barefoot and shifted their weight. I didn't say anything to my family. I just stood there staring at the marks, my mouth dry. Maybe it was nothing, maybe just my mind fitting patterns into the ground, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone standing right there while I was in the tent, listening. Later, when we were packing up to head home, I walked that same spot one last time. The marks were still there, faint but clear enough to see where the grass bent differently, where the damp soil had been pressed. I realized then how quiet the forest had been after the scream. No footsteps running away, no brush snapping, just gone like it had lifted out of the air. On the drive home, I stared out the window, thinking about it over and over. If it had been an animal, I should have heard movement. If it had been another camper, why come so close to our tent in the middle of the night, only to stand there and scream? None of it lined up in a way that made sense. I've camped plenty of times since then, and nothing like that has ever happened again. But sometimes, when the night air is too still and I catch a faint sound in the woods, I remember lying there in the heat of that tent, waiting for another whimper to rise from the dark. And the part that still sticks with me isn't even the scream. It's the way the sound carried, how the faintest whimper meant it was right outside, closer than I wanted to believe. That morning, standing there in the dirt, looking at those faint impressions by the trees, I knew someone or something had been watching us. Not from far away, not passing through, but right there. Close enough that if I'd unzipped the tent, I might have seen them standing in the dark, listening to me hold my breath. I went camping in Norway a couple of years back during the summer, and that trip still sits in my memory clearer than most. It was one of those times when everything around you feels too big and too wild to belong to the same world you live your normal life in. The air, the light, the quiet, all of it felt different out there. I had gone to get away, to spend some days hiking and sleeping under the sky where the sun barely dipped below the horizon that time of year. I had pitched my tent on a stretch of open ground not far from a small lake. The water was still and flat, like a mirror reflecting the pale summer sky, and around it stretched nothing but rolling ground and scattered patches of scrub. The colors were sharp, too. The grass deep green, the rocks gray and streaked with lichen, the tent bright orange against it all. It was quiet there, almost unnervingly so, with no sounds of people, no traffic, just the distant rustle of wind and the occasional bird cutting across the sky. That night had been calm. I stayed awake longer than usual, half lying in my sleeping bag with the flap open, staring at the strange light of the sky that never fully darkened. When I finally drifted off, it was with that odd sense that time had slowed down. The morning came early, though it was hard to even call it morning with how the sun had barely dipped. I woke halfway, in that heavy state where your eyes are closed but your mind drifts between dreaming and real sounds outside. I lay there listening to the faint brush of wind against the tent fabric, debating whether I should get up and start the day or let myself drift back off. That's when it happened. The tent suddenly shook violently, as though someone had grabbed it and yanked hard. My first thought wasn't animals. Out there, animals weren't something I expected to come across so close. My brain jumped immediately to people, and not the friendly kind. A random hiker, someone messing with me, someone who thought it would be funny to play around with a lone camper's tent. The shaking was so sudden and aggressive that it sent a shock through me. My heart jumped into my throat, and before I even fully thought it through, I had unzipped the tent and shot out barefoot, still in my pants, ready to confront whoever was on the other side. But it wasn't a person I found. It wasn't one figure standing there at all. I came out into a wall of movement and sound, and it took my brain a moment to even understand what I was seeing. There were reindeer, caribou everywhere. They surrounded the tent in every direction, their bodies pressing close, antlers towering above me like jagged branches, hooves clattering against the ground as they shifted and moved. There weren't just a few of them. There were hundreds, at least 100 within sight, maybe more stretching further across the plain. The one closest to me had tripped over the lines of the tent. That must have been what caused the sudden jolt. It stood there, just a few feet away, breathing heavily, its body large and solid in a way that felt intimidating at that range. Its dark eyes fixed on me as if unsure what I was, whether I was a threat or just something odd that had appeared in its way. Behind it, more of them shifted restlessly, their antlers clacking against one another, their hooves sending dull thuds through the ground I could feel in my bare feet. For a long moment, I stood frozen. I wasn't afraid in the way you fear a predator, but there was a sharp unease all the same. To be surrounded like that, hemmed in by animals larger and stronger than me, all moving as one, was overwhelming. Any wrong move could spook them, and I had no control over what would happen then. The herd moved slowly, flowing around me, the tent now just another obstacle in their path. Their bodies brushed against the guy lines, some stepping carefully, others bumping into them without much care. I could hear them breathing, could smell the musky, earthy scent that hung around them, a wildness that didn't belong to me or my world. They didn't pay me much mind after that first startled look, but their sheer presence pressed down on me. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. I stood there barefoot in the cold grass, heart still racing, while the herd continued on its way. Slowly, they spread out, the closest ones moving forward until the whole wave of bodies was passing beyond my tent, hooves clattering against stone and soft ground, antlers catching the pale light. One by one, they shifted away until the noise thinned out, replaced again by the steady quiet of the open land. When the last of them had moved on, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The ground around my tent was marked with prints, the lines of the tent half pulled loose, the whole setup leaning at an awkward angle. My heart was still hammering from the shock, but what struck me most was how small I felt. Out there, I had thought I was alone in this vast place, but the herd had reminded me that the land wasn't mine, that I was just another figure passing through their world. I spent the rest of the morning sitting outside, watching the plain where they had gone, half expecting to see them return. But they didn't. The silence settled back in as if nothing had happened. I repaired the tent lines, made some food, tried to calm down, but the adrenaline stayed with me the rest of the day. By evening, when the light stayed stretched across the sky again, I realized just how close I had been to something that could have gone very differently. If the herd had panicked, if they had stampeded through, the tent and I could have been trampled without a second thought. It wasn't malice, just sheer size and numbers, an unstoppable force that didn't need to notice me to crush me. When I packed up a couple of days later, I felt different about the place. The wild didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, unpredictable, and much larger than I had imagined when I first arrived. I left with the memory of those antlers rising above me like a moving forest and the ground trembling under their hooves. That trip taught me that being out there isn't just about peace and quiet. It's about being small in a world that doesn't notice you, where everything else moves with its own rhythm, whether you're ready for it or not. And even now, years later, whenever I step into a tent, I remember that morning, the violent shake, the rush outside, and the sea of reindeer pressing around me. It's a reminder that the wild doesn't bend to you. You bend to it. I went camping one summer in July, and even now, years later, there's a single image from that trip that still unsettles me more than anything else I've seen outdoors. I've run into bears on trails, heard coyotes circling camp at night, and even woken to the sound of something big moving through the brush just feet from my tent. But nothing has stuck with me quite like what I stumbled across that hot afternoon in the middle of an empty field. The trip itself started normal enough. I had driven out to a small, tucked-away campground near the edge of a forest preserve. It wasn't the kind of place with picnic tables or RV hookups, just a patch of flat ground where a handful of people could pitch tents if they were willing to rough it. The air was heavy with summer heat, the kind that presses down on you even in the shade, and the forest buzzed with the constant hum of insects. I set up my tent near the tree line, just close enough to the woods for some shade, and I figured I'd take a walk to explore before cooking dinner. The land there opened up into a wide field, grass up to my knees in some places, yellowing under the sun. From the edge of the trees, it looked like nothing special, just open space with a few scraggly bushes scattered here and there. I stepped into it anyway, curious to see how far it stretched. The ground was dry and cracked in places, the kind of heat that bakes the soil until it feels like stone. Sweat was already dripping down my neck by the time I was halfway across. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves or maybe a clump of fur left behind by some animal. But as I got closer, I realized it was two squirrels. They were lying side by side, bodies pressed together like they had been huddling for warmth, though the sun was beating down mercilessly on them. Their little paws were curled tight, tails stiff, eyes closed as if they'd just lain down and gone still. But they weren't sleeping. They were dead. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what I was looking at. Squirrels don't just drop dead in the middle of an open field, let alone two together pressed close like that. My first thought was poisoning. Maybe they'd gotten into something they shouldn't have. But even then, why would they have ended up like this, curled into each other out in the open instead of tucked away in the trees where they usually live? The longer I stared, the more questions I had and the fewer answers came to me. There were no visible injuries, no blood, no signs of a predator. Their fur wasn't matted, and the ground around them wasn't disturbed, like they hadn't struggled. They just lay there, perfectly still, as if whatever had happened had come on sudden and quick. I crouched down, trying to make sense of it. The heat pressed into my back, and the grass whispered in the faint breeze, but I was locked on the sight of them. It wasn't just the fact that they were dead, it was the way they were dead. Two creatures that had probably lived their whole lives darting through trees, always skittish and quick, brought down together in the middle of an open space, side by side like they had clung to each other at the last moment. A chill ran through me, despite the sweat dripping down my face. I don't know why, but it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I wasn't supposed to see it. It was just nature, I told myself. Things die all the time out here. But that explanation didn't stick. It wasn't the death itself. It was the mystery of it, the way it didn't fit with anything I understood about how things worked. I backed away slowly. The image burned into my mind. The rest of the field suddenly felt different, like the air had thickened, like I was walking through something heavy and unseen. I made my way back to the trees and then to my camp, trying to shake it off. But that night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way they had been curled together, the stillness of their little bodies, the absence of any reason. When the fire burned down and the woods grew darker, the feeling only got worse. I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric above me, listening to every sound outside. The snap of branches, the high whine of insects, the rustle of leaves shifting in the breeze. Normally those sounds were background noise, the familiar soundtrack of a night outdoors. But now they pressed in on me, each one sharp, each one drawing me back to the thought of those squirrels. What had taken them down so suddenly? Was it poison in the water? Heat stroke? Some kind of sickness? If it was, could it be in the air? In the ground? Was I lying here breathing it in, drinking from the same stream. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured them again, still and small, huddled together in the grass with the sun beating down. I thought about how random it must have been, how they had no idea when they woke up that morning that it would be their last. They were just going about their lives, same as always, until something stopped them cold. That thought wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I considered packing up early. The place no longer felt like the quiet escape I had wanted. It felt off, like there was something in the air I couldn't see. I forced myself to go about my normal routine, boil water, make coffee, eat a little, but the unease stayed. I didn't go back into the field. I couldn't bring myself to look at them again. I lasted one more night before I finally left. The trip had been meant to clear my head, but instead, it left me with something I still can't explain. To this day, I don't know what happened to those squirrels. I've read about parasites, about sudden disease, about animals being caught out in heat they can't handle. But nothing explains the way they were found. Two together, side by side, curled into each other in the middle of a field where they didn't belong. That image has never left me. It wasn't gory or dramatic, but it was haunting in its own quiet way, because it reminded me that the natural world doesn't always give you answers. Sometimes you stumble across something that simply doesn't make sense, and you're left to carry it with you, replaying it over and over, trying to fit it into what you know. Even now, when I think about camping, I see them there, two small bodies in the grass, frozen in a moment I'll never understand. And the more I think about it, the more it unsettles me. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Because no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind, I still draw a blank. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. I've camped through all kinds of weather, but the night I spent out in the middle of a thunderstorm is one that has stayed with me the longest. Not because of the rain or the noise, but because of what I found the next morning, when the sky cleared and the world seemed calm again. That trip left me with an image that I still can't get rid of, and it comes back to me every time I hear thunder rolling in the distance. It was July, high summer, and the air was thick with heat and humidity. I had driven out to a remote campsite near the edge of a large meadow bordered by forest. The spot was quiet, open enough to feel free, but with plenty of tree cover nearby if I wanted shade. I had chosen it on purpose because I knew very few people ever camped there, and I wanted space. I pitched my bright-colored tent near the tree line, gathered some wood, and settled in, glad to have the land to myself. The day went by uneventfully. I hiked a few trails, fished a bit in a nearby stream, and then sat by the fire as the evening light stretched out. It was hot enough that the air felt heavy, and I noticed how still everything became as the sun dipped lower. The birds quieted down, the breeze died out, and the silence felt strange, like the forest was holding back. By the time I crawled into my tent, I could feel the pressure in the air, that heavy warning that always comes before a storm. Sometime in the night, it broke loose. The first roll of thunder was so deep it rattled through the ground and into my chest. Then the wind came hard, shaking the tent walls, carrying the smell of ozone and rain. When the lightning started, it lit up the inside of my tent like a flashbulb, bright enough that I could see every crease in the fabric. The cracks of thunder followed so close behind that I knew the storm was right over me. I lay there, half awake, half bracing for something worse, as the rain hammered down and the thunder never stopped rolling. The lightning came again and again, some strikes so bright I could see the silhouettes of the trees outside. At one point, the ground seemed to tremble, as if a strike had landed close by. It felt like the entire world had shrunk to the thin nylon walls around me and the roar of the storm outside. Eventually, sometime before dawn, the storm passed. The rain thinned, the thunder moved off, and I drifted into a restless sleep. By the time I opened my eyes again, the sun was already high, and the air was damp but warming quickly. The meadow outside looked washed clean, every blade of grass dripping, the soil dark and soft. The sky above was that strange, clear blue that only seems to come after a storm. I stepped out, stretching, feeling the wet ground under my boots as I moved toward the open field to take in the sight. That's when I saw something unusual in the middle of the grass. At first, it looked like just a darker patch of earth, a lump in the sea of green. As I walked closer, it took shape. There, in the middle of the meadow, were two squirrels, dead. Their bodies were twisted together, lying so close it looked almost deliberate. Their fur singed in small patches, tails stiff and sticking out awkwardly, stopped me in my tracks. I crouched down, studying them, trying to understand what I was looking at. Their tiny mouths were open, teeth bared slightly, eyes clouded over. Their bodies were pressed close, as if they had clung to each other at the end. And then I noticed it, the blackened patch of grass just a foot away, a circle where the blades had been burned down to nothing. It hit me then. Lightning. They must have been caught out in the open during the storm, and a strike had landed close enough to kill them instantly. The circle of scorched earth was proof, and the way they were curled into each other made the scene even stranger. It was unsettling, the thought of two small creatures caught at the wrong place at the wrong time, snuffed out by something so sudden and powerful. I stayed there longer than I should have, staring. The whole meadow felt eerily still, as if the storm had taken something from it. Even the usual insect buzz seemed muted, like the field was holding on to what had happened there. Walking back to camp, I couldn't shake the image. The storm had kept me awake, had rattled me inside my tent, but I'd been safe under nylon and trees. Out in the open, though, those squirrels hadn't stood a chance. It made me think about how fragile the line is between being fine and being gone. Just a few feet closer, just a little less luck, and that strike could have been me. The rest of the day, I moved slower, uneasy, constantly glancing at the sky. It was clear and blue now, but I didn't trust it. I went about my routine, boiled water, made coffee, cleaned up camp, but every time I stopped, the picture of those squirrels came back. Their bodies locked together, the burned grass beside them, the reminder of how small and powerless we are against something as sudden as lightning. That night, I hardly slept. Every rustle of leaves, every groan of the trees in the wind, sent my heart racing again. I kept expecting another storm to roll in, another strike to come crashing down, even though the forecast had promised clear skies. My tent, which usually felt like shelter, suddenly felt paper thin, no protection at all against the kind of force I'd witnessed. The next morning, I packed up early. I couldn't relax there anymore. The meadow, the trees, the whole place felt marked by what I'd seen. As I hiked back toward the trail that led to my car, I glanced once more toward the field. From that distance, the spot where they lay was invisible, just part of the endless grass, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what was there, and I carried that picture with me. Even now, I still see it clearly whenever I think about camping in storms. Two small lives, gone in an instant, left twisted together in the grass as proof of how sudden and final nature can be. There's no explanation beyond that. No hidden meaning, no deeper mystery. Just the reminder that out there, under the open sky, things can happen without warning. And sometimes all you can do is keep moving, carrying the image with you, knowing it could have been you instead. That trip taught me something I can't unlearn. The wild doesn't care if you're ready. It doesn't pause for you to prepare or step aside. It strikes when it strikes, and all you can do is hope you're not standing in the wrong place when it does. And that knowledge has never left me. I've done plenty of camping and fishing trips by myself, and I've had my fair share of unnerving experiences. Storms, strange animal noises, even that prickling feeling when you're sure someone's watching you though no one's around. But none of that compares to the weekend I went out for a solo fly fishing trip in the mountains. What I stumbled across out there is something I still think about, and it changed the way I see being alone in the wild. It started like any other summer outing. I had a long weekend free, and I wanted to clear my head. I packed my fly rod, my waders, a small tent, some food, and a few basics. I drove out toward the mountains and parked where the road ended, then hiked in with everything I needed strapped to my back. My plan was simple: set up camp by the creek, fish for trout all day, cook what I caught, and enjoy the quiet. The hike in was peaceful. The sun was out, the air warm but not unbearable, and the trail led me through thick pine forest that opened up every so often to views of the valley below. After about an hour, I came to the creek. It was clear and fast in spots, slow and glassy in others, with pools that practically begged to be cast into. I found a flat spot near the bank under some trees and pitched my tent, then pulled on my waders and strung up my rod. By mid-morning, I was standing midstream, casting into a run where the current split around a boulder. The water was cool against my legs, the rhythm of casting steady and calming. I was in that zone where you stop thinking about anything but the line and the water. That's when I heard it. At first it was faint, almost like a bird call, except it wasn't clear. It sounded garbled, broken up, like a voice trying to push through mud. I stopped casting and listened. The sound came from upstream, carried faintly over the water. Then it stopped. I shook it off, figuring it was maybe an animal or just my mind filling in random noises from the forest. I went back to fishing, but the sound came again a few minutes later. This time it was louder, a wet, choking kind of noise, not like any bird I'd ever heard. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the kind of sound nature makes on its own. It was human. I stood there, rod in hand, staring upstream. The creek curved out of sight about 50 yards ahead, and the trees crowded close on both sides. Something in me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard, but curiosity and unease pushed harder. After another cast or two, I gave up and told myself I'd check it out when I broke for lunch. By noon the sun was high, and I waded out, stripped off my waders, and grabbed some food from camp. I followed the creek upstream, carrying only a water bottle and a granola bar, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a wounded animal, maybe just water echoing strangely. But as I walked, the sound came again, closer now, and this time I knew without doubt it was a human noise. I rounded the bend, and that's when I saw him. He was lying half in the grass, half on the gravel of the creek bank. A man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, clothes dirty, shirt soaked dark around his chest. Beside him, on the ground, was a handgun. His body was twisted awkwardly, his face pale, eyes half open, mouth moving weakly. The garbled sounds I'd been hearing were his attempts to breathe, to make noise, to something. I froze. My mind couldn't catch up with what I was seeing. At first I thought he was dead, but then his chest moved shallowly. He was alive, barely. The shock gave way to panic. I was miles from service. I had no way of calling for help from there. I couldn't lift him, couldn't carry him out. I felt that crushing helplessness, standing there staring at someone who had clearly tried to end his life and failed, and was now clinging to the edge. I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the sprint back down the creek, just the pounding of my boots on wet rocks and the hammering of my heart. I grabbed what I needed at camp, keys, wallet, phone, and left everything else. The hike back to where my car was parked felt endless, and every step I was replaying the sight of him, the gun, the blood. When I finally got into service, I called 911 with shaking hands. I tried to explain where I was, gave them trail names, landmarks, anything I could remember. They told me to stay put until law enforcement and medics arrived, but I knew I had to guide them in. No one would find that man without someone leading the way. It took time, more time than I wanted, for them to get there. A couple of deputies and a medic crew met me at the trailhead, and I led them back in. The hike that morning had felt peaceful, but now every step was heavy. My mind was racing with the thought that he might already be gone by the time we got there. When we rounded the bend, he was still there, still alive but barely. The medics rushed in, checked him, started working. I stepped back, my body buzzing with adrenaline and dread. I didn't know what to do with myself, so I just stood there, staring at the creek while they worked. Eventually, they got him stabilized enough to move. They radioed in for more help, a stretcher, a plan to get him out. I couldn't stay. One of the deputies told me I'd done the right thing, that leaving when I did probably gave him his only chance. I nodded, but it didn't feel like any kind of relief. I hiked back out alone again, this time slower. I never found out if he survived. They never told me, and I didn't ask. But the image of him lying there, the gun by his side, the sound of those garbled noises echoing over the creek, that stuck with me. That night, lying in my tent, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Every crack of a branch or splash of water sounded like that choked noise. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt haunted by something very real and very human. I packed up before sunrise the next day and left. I couldn't keep fishing. I couldn't sit by the creek knowing what had happened just upstream. Even now, years later, the memory comes back sharp and clear. Not in a storybook way, not in a way that fades. Just raw, real, unsettling. Camping used to mean escape to me. That trip changed it. It reminded me that no matter how far you go into the quiet, you're never far from the weight people carry. Out there, under the trees and sky, I'd stumbled across someone's darkest moment, and it made me realize how fragile the line is, not just between life and death, but between peace and chaos. That was the last time I went out solo for a long while, and even when I started again, I never walked upstream to check out strange sounds without thinking back to that day, to that man lying by the creek, and how close I'd been to not knowing he was there at all. I've camped many times in my life, and I've always been drawn to it for the same reasons most people are. The quiet, the chance to get away from the noise of towns and cities, the way the air feels different when you're far from streetlights and traffic. I've had nights of peace, mornings of clear skies, and plenty of good memories. But there was one trip that stuck in me like a thorn, and I don't think I'll ever look at camping or even the countryside the same way again. It happened in the rural part of the UK, where the fields stretch long and green, with hedgerows cutting them up into neat little sections, and the air carries the sound of crows, distant tractors, and the occasional barking dog from some farm miles away. It's the sort of place where time feels slower, where life moves at a pace you don't really get in the city. I went there one summer, deciding to spend a weekend camping near my uncle's place. His house sat at the edge of a small village, the kind with narrow lanes, stone walls, and old cottages that looked like they had stood for centuries. His garden stretched a long way back, sloping down toward a small thicket of trees and a stream. I pitched my tent not far from there, on a patch of grass where the ground was fairly even. It wasn't wild camping in the strict sense. I was still technically on my uncle's property, but it had that same feeling. No sounds of traffic, no artificial light once the sun dipped. Just me, the tent, and the expanse of the countryside rolling away in every direction. I had brought a small stove, a few cans of food, and my sleeping bag. My uncle had waved me off, joking about me playing survivalist in his back garden. But he knew I just wanted space to myself. That first evening was calm. I sat by the tent, watching the sky shift through shades of orange and pink before sinking into dusk. The smell of cut grass and the faint smoke of someone's chimney carried on the breeze. By the time the stars showed, I felt completely at ease. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and listened to the faint rustling of the hedges and the owls calling from the woods. It was the sort of night that would normally lull me to sleep quickly. But that night, something woke me. It must have been around 11 or 12, though I didn't check my watch. I remember lying there, half asleep, when I heard a sound. It wasn't the natural noise of the countryside. It was sharper, heavier. At first, I thought it was someone shutting a car door out on the lane. But then it came again, a muffled crack that echoed strangely across the fields. My body tensed because I knew, even without wanting to admit it, what that sound was. It was a gunshot. Guns aren't common in the UK. You don't just hear them randomly in the night, not out there. The only people who tend to have them are farmers, and even then, it's usually for vermin control. But this wasn't the quick pop of a rifle at crows. It was heavier, deeper, a shotgun. I sat up in the tent, straining to hear anything else. The night seemed to close in around me, quiet in that suffocating way where even the wind seems to hold its breath. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I heard something else. It was a stumbling sound, uneven footsteps on grass. Not close, but not far either, coming from the direction of the gardens that ran behind the cottages. I unzipped the tent quietly and peered out into the night. The moon was bright enough to see the outlines of things. The hedges, the shed at the back of my uncle's garden, the stretch of grass that sloped down. And that's when I saw him, a figure moving slowly, staggering in that unnatural way, as if every step hurt. He was coming up from the bottom of the neighboring garden, the one separated from my uncle's by a low fence. At first, I thought maybe it was just some drunk, someone who had wandered outside after too much drink. But as he drew closer to the faint light spilling from a kitchen window of the cottage, I saw his face, or what was left of it. I can't explain fully what it did to me in that moment. My body went cold, my mouth dry, every part of me screaming to look away but unable to. His lower jaw was gone, or rather, it was there but destroyed, torn away by the force of the shotgun blast. Blood soaked his shirt, dark patches that glistened wetly in the moonlight. His head hung at an odd angle, and with each stagger forward, he let out wet, choking noises, like a person trying to breathe through water. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. He looked less like a man and more like some broken puppet dragged back from the edge of death. He clutched at his throat, his chest, as if trying to hold himself together. Every now and then he stopped, swayed, and then took another stumbling step toward the house. I knew instantly what had happened. He had gone down to the bottom of his garden, put the shotgun under his chin, and pulled the trigger. But at the last second, either his nerve failed or the angle was wrong. Instead of ending his life, he had torn his own face apart and was now staggering back up toward the house in some half-dead state. I couldn't move, couldn't shout. I just crouched in the flap of my tent, frozen as I watched him cross the garden like something out of a nightmare. Every step he took burned into my mind. The swaying, the dripping, the sound of his feet dragging across the grass. Eventually, he reached the back door of his cottage. He fumbled at it, leaving smears of blood along the wood before collapsing against it. That's when I finally snapped out of it. My stomach heaved, and I stumbled back into my tent, shaking so hard I could barely control my breath. I lay there, waiting for sirens, waiting for shouting, waiting for anything. But the night dragged on quiet, broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere across the fields. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every sound made me flinch. I kept seeing his face in my mind, the way his jaw had been blasted away, the way he looked less alive than something animated by sheer pain and instinct. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the tent, my nerves were raw. When I finally went back up to my uncle's house, I found him already awake, looking pale and shaken. The police had been there during the night. An ambulance, too. The neighbor had survived, but only just. They'd taken him away to hospital. My uncle said he wished he hadn't seen it, that he would have rather not known. But he had witnessed the whole thing from his window, and it haunted him. For me, it wasn't just seeing the man. It was the way it shattered the sense of safety I'd always carried into the countryside. I had gone out there for peace, to camp under the stars, to enjoy the quiet. But instead, I learned that even in the most peaceful places, horror can walk right past you, stumbling through the night like a broken shadow. I packed up my tent that morning and left. I couldn't stay another night. Every rustle of the hedge, every crack of a branch, sounded like that man dragging himself back up the garden. It wasn't something I could shake off. Years have passed, and I still camp, but I carry that night with me every time I zip a tent shut. I think about how fragile people are, how close pain lives to the surface, even in the most ordinary corners of life. And I think about that night in rural England, watching a man who should have been dead stumble through the moonlight, and how it made the countryside feel like the darkest place I've ever been. I've spent enough time outdoors, camping in different places, to know that the woods and countryside can show you things you never expect. Sometimes it's a beautiful sunrise that makes you forget the weight of your life for a while, or the quiet sound of owls at night that rocks you to sleep better than any bed could. Other times, though, it's something you wish you could unsee, something that sticks in your head so deeply that years later you can still remember the smell of the air and the way the world looked in that exact moment. The worst night of my life camping didn't happen in some foreign wilderness or miles from civilization. It happened in rural England, in a place that, on the surface, couldn't have been more peaceful. I had gone to visit my uncle, who lived in a small village tucked away in the countryside. His house was old, stone-built, with a long garden stretching down toward a row of trees at the bottom. The whole area was the kind of postcard scene you'd expect. Rolling fields, hedgerows, narrow lanes with grass pushing up through the cracks in the tarmac, and the smell of wood smoke lingering in the evenings. I brought my tent with me. My plan was to spend the weekend camping on his property, setting up down near the bottom of his garden by the hedge, just far enough away from the house to feel like I was properly outside but still within reach of a hot shower and a kettle if I needed it. My uncle laughed when I told him where I wanted to pitch, calling it playing soldier. But he didn't mind. He knew I liked the outdoors and the feeling of being away from everything. That Friday afternoon, I set up my tent. The grass was soft and dry, the ground fairly level. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, organized my gear, and then sat for a while with a cup of tea, looking out across the open fields beyond the garden. The hedgerows swayed in the breeze. Crows called out from somewhere in the distance, and I felt that strange mix of comfort and isolation that camping always gives me. As the evening came on, my uncle called me up for dinner. We ate together in his kitchen, the radio playing softly in the background, while the sun dropped behind the hills. By the time I went back down to my tent, the garden was dark, with only the faint glow from a neighbor's window shining through the trees. I zipped myself into the tent, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and listened to the countryside settle into night. It was around midnight when everything changed. I woke up suddenly, not because of a dream, but because of a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. It wasn't the rustle of an animal or the creak of branches. It was sharper, heavier. My brain took a second to catch up before it placed it. A gunshot. In the UK, especially in a quiet village, you don't just hear gunshots in the middle of the night. I froze, listening, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. The night went silent again, so still it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that my brain had mistaken something else. But then I heard another sound, something far worse. It was the sound of footsteps, dragging and uneven, moving slowly up through the grass. At first I thought it might be an animal limping, but then I realized it was too heavy, too human. I unzipped the flap of my tent just enough to peek out, and that's when I saw him. At the bottom of the neighboring garden, a figure was moving, stumbling. His body swayed with each step, and in the faint light from the cottage window I could see his face, or what was left of it. His jaw was gone, blown apart. Blood poured down his chest, soaking his shirt. His head hung at an unnatural angle, and with each movement he made a wet, choking noise, like air trying to force its way through a blocked pipe. It didn't look real. It didn't look possible. But it was there, in front of me, in the quiet of that rural night. My stomach dropped. I realized what had happened. He had taken a shotgun down to the bottom of his garden, intending to kill himself. But at the last moment, whether his nerve failed or the angle was off, he had pulled the trigger and destroyed his jaw instead of ending his life. Now he was staggering back toward the house, alive but in a state no person should ever have to endure. I stayed frozen in my tent, unable to move, my whole body trembling. Couldn't look away. His face, his ruined mouth, the dark stains spreading across his shirt. It was like watching something crawl out of a nightmare. He looked less like a man and more like something half dead, dragging itself forward on instinct. He made it up the garden slowly, swaying, sometimes falling against the fence before pushing himself upright again. The sounds he made were worse than the sight, low, gurgling, inhuman noises that echoed in the stillness of the night. He left smears of blood along the wood of the fence, across the back door, as he fumbled with it. Then he collapsed against the door, slumping to the ground. Couldn't breathe. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it would burst. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, to do something, but I couldn't. I crouched in the darkness of my tent, barely daring to breathe, my mind locked on the horror I had just seen. At some point, lights flicked on in my uncle's house. I heard movement, muffled voices, then the distant sound of sirens approaching along the lane. Time blurred after that. The police came, then an ambulance. I stayed hidden in my tent, too shaken to step out, until eventually the noise faded and the night returned to its suffocating silence. I didn't sleep again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I saw the way he moved, the way his body jerked unnaturally, the blood that glistened under the moonlight. I felt trapped in that moment, unable to pull myself back into the safety I had felt just hours before. By dawn, I packed up my tent with shaking hands. My uncle looked pale when I went up to the house. He told me what had happened, that the neighbor had survived the night but was in critical condition, taken to hospital. He didn't know if the man would make it, and part of him wasn't sure if he wanted him to. My uncle said he wished he hadn't seen it at all, that the image of the man stumbling up the garden was burned into his memory. For me, it was worse because I had been outside, alone, watching it from the shadows of my tent. It didn't feel real, but it was. And once you see something like that, you can't go back to not knowing it exists. That weekend changed the way I look at camping at night, at the quiet of the countryside. It used to mean peace and escape to me. Now it carries a weight, a reminder that horror doesn't just belong in cities or stories. It can be waiting in the most ordinary of places, stepping out of the darkness when you least expect it. I still camp, but I never forget that night. I never forget the sound of footsteps dragging through the grass, the gurgling noises that didn't sound human, the sight of a man who looked like he'd already crossed into death, but kept moving anyway. My uncle told me later he struggled with it for years, waking up from nightmares, unable to sit in his garden at night without seeing it again. I understood, because no matter how much time passes, I still see it too, and I know I always will.